A decorated black veteran was dragged off a city bus in handcuffs by the very officers he was about to command. One chose pride over truth, ignoring every sign of who stood before him. But Marcus Reed had one powerful weapon they hadn't expected: quiet authority and a sealed folder. And just wait until you hear how this calm man turned the entire department on its head, and why justice, in the end, stood tall beside him. It was just after 7 p.m. when the #14 bus pulled into the stop at Maple and 3rd, a routine end-of-day lull, the kind where nobody looks at anyone too long, and the air smells faintly of paper bags, old receipts, and worn-out shoes. People were headed home from warehouse shifts, hospital floors, long days behind counters. Headphones in, heads down, patience thin. The kind of ride where you hope nothing happens. But something had. The driver's call came in as suspicious male, refusing to move, possible confrontation. In less than 3 minutes, a squad car coasted up beside the curb. Officers Kyle Denton and Haley Brooks stepped off the asphalt and onto the platform. Standard-issue vests, radio chatter buzzing low, boots wet from the earlier rain. They didn't enter with sirens or shouting, just that specific kind of posture, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, a quiet claim to authority that doesn't ask for permission. They scanned the bus like it was a puzzle missing a piece. The driver, still seated behind the plexiglass, pointed toward the middle. There, in a side-facing seat near the back, sat a black man in his late 30s. Faded field jacket, military-cut hair, calm, upright posture. A duffel bag rested against his boots, worn canvas, the kind that had traveled. Marcus Reed had been on the bus less than 20 minutes. He'd nodded to the driver, tapped his transit card, found a seat near the back. He wasn't talking to anyone, hadn't raised his voice. His only interaction had been declining to give up his seat when another rider claimed he looked suspicious. That rider got off 2 stops ago, still muttering. Marcus had just texted his sister. Running late, first day nerves kicking in, hope this precinct's different. Denton approached, expression unreadable but body rigid. He stopped just inches from Marcus, leaning in slightly. Not enough to touch, but enough to crowd. The tone came next, clipped and familiar. ID. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't sigh, didn't ask why like some might. He'd seen this before. He reached slowly into his inside jacket pocket, kept his movements visible. Wallet out. ID passed over without a word. Name, Denton asked, though it was printed clearly on the card he already held. Marcus Reed, Marcus said calmly. I'm heading to the... Step off the bus. It wasn't a request. It wasn't yelled either, just flat and firm, one of those commands that dares you to question it. Marcus paused, not out of defiance, but calculation. There were protocols for this. He'd written them. He began to speak again. Officer, if I could explain, That's when Denton reached out. A firm grip closed on Marcus's arm, just above the elbow. Not violent, but not voluntary either. Brooks, a step behind, moved in on instinct. She grabbed the duffel from the floor like it might contain something dangerous. It didn't. It carried 2 uniforms, an unopened notebook, and a sealed folder. Someone near the front muttered, "Yo, what did he do?" A phone came up, then 2. A teenager across the aisle hit record without even thinking, thumb tapping instinctively, like muscle memory. A woman in scrubs looked away, jaw tight. Someone else muttered, "Every time." Marcus didn't resist. That word, resist, was the tripwire. He rose slowly, deliberately, like every inch of movement mattered. Denton guided him down the narrow aisle. Outside, the mist was turning to drizzle. The streetlights had just come on. They pressed him against the glass wall of the bus shelter, his cheek flat against the cold. His wrists were cuffed behind his back with an efficiency that came from habit. It was clinical, it was fast, it was unnecessary. Someone gasped. It was small but real, the kind of gasp that comes when people see something they thought only happened on the news. No one on that bus knew who Marcus was, not yet. They just saw what they saw, a black man being pulled off public transit, handled like a suspect before a single question had been answered. And they saw what they always see, the silence of authority and the weight it carries. In less than 60 seconds, a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened a soul, hadn't broken a law, was now on the ground, cuffed, soaked, and surrounded by officers. And in that moment, nobody knew the one thing that changed everything. He was their new commander. Kyle Denton didn't wake up that morning intending to throw anyone against a wall. He ironed his uniform like always, fed his dog, texted his daughter a meme she wouldn't answer. He was 3 years into patrol, 10 years into marriage, and 6 months into knowing both might not last much longer. He wasn't one of the bad ones, as the city liked to label officers in headlines when something blew up. He had commendations, had volunteered for night duty during the floods, had once helped deliver a baby on the freeway shoulder. But lately, that didn't seem to matter much. The department was under heat, not for violence, for weakness. All spring, headlines hammered Riverton PD for backing off too much. Officers being too soft on fare jumpers, too slow to respond to nuisance calls, too worried about optics. The talk radio stations were relentless, comment sections frothed. The union felt the pressure and passed it down in memos with bold fonts and careful phrasing. Captain Yeager's email had come last week. Denton had printed it out, folded it into thirds, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his vest like it was scripture. The subject line was, "Command Presence and Field Expectations." The body read, "In uncertain times, the burden is on us to be the standard. Be assertive. Don't defer to ambiguity. Do not let a situation control you. We set the tone." Kyle had read that email every day since. He was already on edge when the call came in. A Code 11, non-compliant male, refusing to vacate, possibly intoxicated, possibly agitated, possibly armed. Always possibly. By the time he and Brooks arrived at the scene, the script had already started writing itself. And Kyle Denton, the man who'd once hesitated and been marked down for it, decided he would not blink tonight. He would take control. Brooks followed his lead. She was still green, 6 months on the street, freshly transferred from a small-town department and just 2 years removed from an Army Reserve unit that never deployed. She wore her professionalism like armor, polished and stiff, always afraid of doing something wrong, more afraid of doing nothing at all. When she heard non-compliant male, her training filled in the blanks. Words like escalation and command presence clicked into place like parts of a rifle. She didn't know Marcus. She didn't need to. The radio had spoken, and the manual took over. On the sidewalk, as the mist thickened and the city lights blinked red and yellow, Denton wasn't reacting to a crime. He was reacting to a feeling, a slow-burning resentment he didn't have a name for yet. Because Marcus Reed didn't act like the people they were usually called to deal with. He didn't yell, he didn't posture, he didn't shrink or fold. He was calm, controlled, measured, and that, somehow, was the most threatening thing of all. Denton watched him as they held him against the glass, not squirming, not shouting, just breathing slow. Denton felt something twist in his gut, something that whispered, "He's not afraid of you." That was the moment Denton started rewriting the scene in his head. He took every pause as resistance, every question as defiance. Marcus's silence became a provocation, his stillness a challenge. He wasn't acting the way Denton expected someone in the wrong to act. And the more Marcus held his ground without raising a voice or clenching a fist, the more Denton felt like his grip on the situation, on his authority, was slipping. Hatred is a heavy word, and maybe it wasn't the right one, but it was close. It wasn't hatred of Marcus, not exactly. It was hatred of what Marcus's presence said, without saying anything at all. Marcus didn't shout, "I'm innocent." He didn't have to. He didn't say, "I know my rights." He didn't have to. He stood there, tall and still and proud, and Denton saw something he couldn't admit, not to Brooks, not to internal affairs, not even to himself. The problem wasn't the man in cuffs. It was the mirror he held up. And Kyle Denton hated that reflection. He hated that he hesitated, that his judgment flickered, that his instinct told him to step back, and he ignored it because his pride wouldn't let him be second-guessed by a crowd with cell phones. Brooks didn't see all of that. She saw her senior partner moving with confidence, and she moved too. She didn't know that confidence came not from certainty, but from the fear of looking weak again. And so the script played out. Marcus was logged as uncooperative. His bag was marked for search. The cuffs were tightened just enough to show force, not enough to trigger bruises. Everything done by the book, a book written in ink that always ran one way. They didn't know who he was, not yet. To them, Marcus Reed was just another man on a bus, sitting where he wasn't wanted, asking questions he wasn't supposed to ask, staying calm when he was expected to fold. And for Denton, that made him dangerous. The fluorescent lights in the precinct lobby flickered with the tired hum of a building that had seen too many nights like this. The desk sergeant, an older officer named Tompkins, barely looked up as Denton guided Marcus toward the intake bench. Tompkins sipped lukewarm coffee, pulled out a clipboard, and sighed. Name? Denton answered before Marcus could open his mouth. Reed, Marcus, disorderly conduct, possible resisting. Marcus sat quietly on the wooden bench, hands still cuffed behind him, the zip of Brooks rifling through his duffel the only real sound in the room. He'd said little during the ride over. Not because he was afraid, because he was watching. The way Denton avoided eye contact, the way Brooks seemed to shrink the longer the silence stretched. Now, in the precinct lobby, surrounded by gray walls and worn linoleum, Marcus spoke again. Calm, precise. There's a sealed folder in my bag, he said. Black, city seal, top pocket. Brooks found it almost immediately. Rigid leather, heavy, official. She started to tug it out like it was just another piece of paperwork, but the moment she saw the gold-embossed seal, her fingers slowed. City of Riverton, Police Department. Official appointment. She opened the flap. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly, then again, slower. Her jaw locked, her breath caught. Commander Marcus J. Reed is hereby assigned to the 7th Precinct of the Riverton Police Department, with all duties, honors, and authority therein. She blinked, once, twice. The words didn't change. Her throat went dry. Sergeant, she said, barely above a whisper, holding the folder like it might burn her hands. Sarge, you need to see this. Tompkins took the folder with a puzzled grunt, squinted at the heading, then at the photo clipped inside. It matched the man on the bench, the man in cuffs, the man who hadn't raised his voice, who hadn't made demands, who hadn't tried to pull rank when he easily could have. Denton took one step back and didn't move closer. He didn't lean in, didn't look at the folder, didn't ask to confirm. He waved it off like a child waving away a bad report card. We can't know if that's legit, he muttered, voice flat. Could be fake. Until it's verified, book him. He couldn't afford to believe it, because if it was true, then everything that happened on that bus wasn't just a bad call, it was an indictment. On him, on the department, on the mindset he'd carried like a badge inside his chest. He couldn't look, so he didn't. Marcus, still seated, stared straight ahead. His jaw was tight now. Not clenched, set. The anger didn't scream, it didn't crackle or boil. It hummed, low and steady, just beneath the surface. He thought about the woman in scrubs on the bus, the kid with the phone, the driver who hadn't said a word. They had all seen what they thought was just another man being processed, labeled, filed, silenced. He could have shouted, could have named his title, demanded a call to the chief. Reminded them of his rank, his record, his years in military policing. But he didn't, because he'd spent his life walking into rooms where his presence was questioned before his name was known, and he'd learned that the truth, when it landed at the right moment, hit harder than any outburst ever could. So he breathed in once, the same way he had in Baghdad, outside a blown-out checkpoint, when he had to decide whether to trust a trembling local holding a handwritten pass. And then he said, simply, I want my phone call. The words sat there, heavier than any threat. Brooks still hadn't moved. Her hands were frozen at her sides. The folder lay open on the desk now, plain as day. Tompkins read the letter again and reached for the phone. His hands shook slightly. 20 minutes passed. Then, everything changed. The glass door swung open with purpose, and Chief Eleanor Price walked in like a storm contained in a suit. Silver braid, no makeup. A woman who'd risen through the department not by charm, but by force of will and still-eyed competence. She crossed the lobby without breaking stride. 4 words, sharp as a scalpel. Uncuff Commander Reed, now. The silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was stunned. Denton blinked, as if waking up from a dream. Brooks stepped back. Thompkins stood so fast his chair rolled into the wall. The cuffs came off without a word. Marcus stood, slow, rubbing his wrists, not because they hurt, but because every eye in the room now had to reckon with what they'd missed, what they'd assumed, what they'd done. Chief Price looked at no one but Denton. Her voice was low and even. You will explain, in writing, why your officers transported a superior officer in cuffs without confirming identity, without probable cause, and without reading a single word of documentation in his possession. Denton said nothing. Marcus didn't look at him. He didn't have to. Because anger held in restraint, the kind born from knowing you were right the whole time, doesn't need to shout. It just waits. Until the weight of its truth forces the world to stop pretending it doesn't see. The roll call room at the 7th Precinct was never quiet. Not really. Even on slow mornings, there was always the low murmur of banter, the hiss of overworked coffee pots, the rustle of duty belts being adjusted and vests being zipped. There was a rhythm to it, like any workplace with hierarchy and routine, with inside jokes and people too tired to laugh at them. But this morning, something was different. The energy in the room wasn't casual, it was tight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a cold glow. A pot of coffee steamed silently in the corner, untouched. Officers gathered in loose clusters, their conversation hushed, not out of respect, but anticipation. Near the front, Sergeant Kyle Denton sat at the edge of his seat, both feet planted but one heel tapping, fast and nervous. His eyes kept darting toward the door, then toward the podium. He hadn't slept much. There was a stiffness in his jaw, not from defiance, but from uncertainty. He was bracing himself for something, but he didn't know what form it would take. A few rows behind, Officer Haley Brooks sat quieter than usual. She didn't joke with the rookies like she sometimes did. She didn't sip coffee or check her phone. Her hands were clasped between her knees, her shoulders rounded inward. She hadn't said a word since walking in. Then the room shifted. Chief Eleanor Price entered, clipboard in hand, no small talk, no preamble. She stepped to the front with the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice. "We have a new commander," she said evenly, eyes scanning the room. "He arrived last night, a little earlier than expected." That was all she said. The door behind her opened, and Marcus Reed walked in. He was in full uniform now, midnight blue, precisely pressed, brass bar pins shining beneath the overhead lights. The badge on his chest caught the reflection just enough to remind the room that he wasn't just a visitor. He belonged here. His posture was exact, his expression calm. The same steady eyes from the bus, but now they weren't being scanned. They were doing the scanning. A current passed through the room. Conversations that had been bubbling under the surface stopped cold. Some officers shifted in their chairs, others stared straight ahead, and somewhere near the back, a younger officer lowered his gaze. Denton didn't move. But his jaw went slack, just slightly, enough to betray the drop in his stomach. That subtle, sinking realization that this moment wasn't about recovery. It was about reckoning. Marcus paused at the front of the room. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch for a full 5 seconds, not as a performance, but as proof that silence, when earned, commands more respect than noise ever could. Then he spoke. Clearly, calmly. "Good morning," he said. A pause. "Some of you met me yesterday." Another pause, longer. "Some of you put your hands on me."
The room stayed silent, not in fear, in recognition. "All of you," he continued, "will hear me now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What followed wasn't a speech. It wasn't a lecture. It was a mission brief, precise, purposeful. He told them who he was: a military police officer with deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, a federal investigator for 3 years overseeing law enforcement misconduct cases, a public safety consultant who had trained over a dozen departments in high-pressure response ethics. And then he told them who he had been: a teenager in Atlanta thrown against a squad car for looking like someone, a cadet who once stood in the rain waiting an hour outside a precinct because no one believed he had an appointment, a man who learned, time and again, how easily truth could be swallowed up by perception. He turned toward Brooks first. "Officer Brooks," he said, steady, "you followed a script your training wrote for you, not your conscience. That's not a character flaw. That's a system flaw." She looked up, startled, not by what he said, but by the fact that he didn't condemn her. Not completely. "I believe you can learn," he continued. "You'll be attending my de-escalation block, starting today." She nodded, once, more grateful than guilty. Then Marcus turned toward Denton. This time, the room held its breath. "Sergeant Denton," he said, "you had every opportunity to ask questions. You had every tool to confirm identity. You chose to escalate. You ignored the evidence. And you did so in public, in uniform, and without justification." Denton didn't respond. His face was pale. Not with fear, with the weight of consequence. Marcus's voice stayed even. "Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending internal review and investigation." There was no applause, no verbal approval. This wasn't that kind of room. But something shifted. Not loudly, like a gavel, but like the tilt of a compass needle finding true north. Some officers looked away. Others nodded, almost imprecisely. One rookie leaned forward just enough to show he was listening now. Chief Price didn't speak. She didn't have to. She stepped back and let Marcus stand alone at the podium. The space now his. Satisfaction didn't come as a cheer. It came as stillness. Because in a room where mistakes are usually buried behind doors, today one had been brought into the light. And instead of hiding from it, the new commander stood in front of it, shoulders square, eyes open, voice calm, and said, "I'm here now. We're doing it differently."
The days that followed weren't marked by headlines or sirens. They were marked by deliberate choices. And Marcus Reed made them quickly. He didn't wait for the department to issue a statement. He didn't bury the body cam footage under pending review. He did what too few leaders had done before him. He released everything. The first move came at a press conference held not on the steps of City Hall, but outside the same precinct where he'd once sat cuffed, silent and unseen. Reporters gathered in the early afternoon sun, microphones clipped to their jackets, camera shutters ticking like slow applause. Beside Marcus stood Chief Eleanor Price, arms folded, flanked by members of the Community Oversight Board. But the man everyone noticed was the quietest among them, Ron Mayfield, the bus driver who had watched it all happen and said nothing that night, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what to say. Now, standing beside Marcus, he finally did. "The man never raised his voice," Ron said, looking into the crowd. "He was just tired." No spin, no press consultant, just a working man naming what he saw. Marcus stepped to the mic and spoke clearly. "We will not bury our own mistakes. We will confront them, openly, directly, and with purpose. Because what happened to me is what happens too often, and this time it won't be ignored." The second move was quieter, but no less revolutionary. Marcus issued a new directive across the department: pause at the threshold. Before any officer made physical contact on a low-level call, whether it was a noise complaint, a loitering issue, or a fare dispute, they were required to take 10 full seconds. A literal count out loud pause. Not to hesitate, but to reassess. Was force truly needed? Was the situation what it seemed, or just what it looked like? Some officers scoffed, called it performative, called it soft. But then, in the first week alone, 3 separate confrontations were diffused, including one with a teenager who turned out to be deaf, and another with a man experiencing a diabetic episode mistaken for intoxication. Officer Brooks volunteered to help teach the new policy, not as a punishment, as ownership. "I saw a man and a problem," she told a group of new recruits, her voice steady. "Not a person. That can't happen again, not on my watch." And they listened, not because she was perfect, but because she'd been honest. The third move wasn't written in a memo. It wasn't part of any policy change. It was Marcus, back on the 18 bus. Same stop, same jacket, same time of evening. He sat in the same seat, and this time, people recognized him. There were stares, questions. One woman asked, "Why come back?" He stood up, faced them, and spoke like he did at the precinct. "I didn't choose what happened that night, but I chose what to do with it. I came back because that night started here, and it ends here, with us talking about it, not just recording it." He opened the floor. It wasn't polite. It wasn't easy. People asked raw questions. Do cops really protect people like me? Why'd that officer grab you? What would have happened if the cameras weren't on? Marcus didn't deflect. He didn't dodge. He answered every single one. He apologized to the passengers who had witnessed it, not just for what they saw, but for the silence that followed. He apologized to the city for the breach of trust. And, perhaps most difficult, he turned and said something few expected. And to Sergeant Denton, "I don't excuse what he did, but I understand what shaped it. A system that teaches officers to fear uncertainty more than they value human dignity. That molds men into hammers and tells them everything's a nail." When the disciplinary board issued its ruling, upholding Denton's suspension but offering him a path to return through retraining and supervised field work, the reaction was mixed. Some wanted him gone. Others called it lenient. Marcus stood behind the decision. "Accountability," he said, "is not about revenge. It's about return. It's a path back. If someone's willing to walk it, they should be allowed." And Denton? He took the offer. The first time the 2 men stood face to face again was in a training room. Bare walls, fold-out chairs, a projector humming. Denton avoided Marcus's gaze at first. His voice was low. "I thought being hard made me right," he murmured. Marcus didn't soften, but he didn't cut. "Being right starts with being human," he replied. There was no handshake, not yet, but there was a shift. Something surrendered. Something real. Weeks passed. The city kept moving. Cases kept coming. Uniforms kept clocking in. But changes showed up in subtle ways. The bus driver, Ron Mayfield, started waving when cruisers paused to let him merge. Brooks learned the names of the riders who used to flinch when she stepped on board. One even told her, "You walk different now." A video of Marcus's first roll call, the one where he named what happened and didn't flinch, leaked online. But people didn't share it because of the gotcha moment. They shared it because of what followed. A veteran's anger turned into a blueprint. A department forced to see itself clearly. A city, for once, exhaling. Because satisfaction wasn't a headline. It wasn't an indictment. It wasn't fireworks. It was the click of policies rewritten, the quiet of apologies delivered, the hum of habits rewired. It was a man who had been dragged off a bus, walking back on. Not alone, not bitter, but with the whole room behind him. Because justice didn't shout. It faced the right way. And that was enough.